and in general, and the perception of drought, perhaps in more particular, is something that we observe or that is perceived at the level of the farm, the region, and the globe. That's where the problem actually occurs. And there are interactions with other problems that society has to deal with. But these are the main sort of levels of the organization at which the problem is perceived. The question now is at which level of the organization do we try to look for solutions? And yesterday we had some good references to breeding efforts, to CRISPR-Cas was mentioned as a new promising methodology. Development in the omics, there's a large portfolio of activities, very innovative activities that are all meant to provide solutions. Now that's interesting, to contrast that with the levels of the organization where the problem occurs compared to the levels of the organization where you try to look for a solution. And one person yesterday made the reference also to agronomy and said that we shouldn't forget agronomy. And later in the presentation, I will point to some other aspects that we perhaps may not even look at agronomy, but even at a wider picture in order to address the problem sufficiently. Before I go into this, a few considerations of the terms that I will be using. We talk about scales, about spatial scales and temporal scales. And I will also talk about levels of organization, and this is depicted here with this little sketch from the field, farm, landscape, up to the globe. Now these changes here are discrete changes. If we change the scale, we usually have continuous changes. A few other terms I'd like to introduce here. When we talk about scale, we talk about the extent, we talk about the resolution, and we talk about coverage. This is usually quite often mixed up. I try to be more specific here when talking about scale, distinguishing between extent, resolution, and coverage. With respect to the spatial scale, this is a simplified sketch here to illustrate the meaning of the terms, and also with respect to the temporal scale. But I'm not talking much about the temporal dimension today. Talking about the scale of drought. Now that's, of course, an ambitious question to ask. But if we look at the field level, then we know that drought has a very high spatial and temporal variability, and that's something that we need to be aware of. What you see here is a time plot of the transpiration rate for winter wheat measured with such a gas chamber in a wheat crop for 3 locations within a very small field. And you see here plotted the time throughout the day, and here the time throughout the season. And you see the diurnal curves and the seasonal curves of the transpiration rate for this wheat crop. And what you can see here is that there is a strong diurnal and seasonal course of the transpiration rate, but there's also a large spatial variability, also already within a small field. So quite different environments in which the same crop is grown throughout the season. And if we compare, for instance, different years with this type of plot for this variable, 8 locations in the field, 3 years, then we see that the patterns that we observe in one year are not necessarily the same that we would observe in other years. So high variability related to drought. And that's something that we, of course, need to be aware of. And in the following slides, I will describe some of the characteristics that affect the responses to drought at the different organizational levels. I'm not reading out this slide now because several of the information of this slide are coming back on the following slides. If we look at the plant level, considering drought in the context of climate change, we know, and that's something where I can be short of because there are many experts here in the audience, that there are many physiological processes and traits that we need to be aware of when we talk about drought and responses to drought. Some of the key processes are indicated here on this plot, and some of the traits, drought avoidance traits, drought tolerance traits, are also listed here. We also know that The relative importance and interactions of these traits depends also on the drought, on the timing of the drought, early drought, mid-season drought, late-season drought, and it depends on other on other variables of the climate. So quite a complex system already at the level of the plant. And there are many presentations throughout the program which address different aspects of that. If we move on and look at the crop level, then there's something that we also need to be aware of that we only observe at the field stand. And one characteristic that comes into play here is the canopy temperature, for instance. Canopy temperature is something, I already said that, we only observe at the field stand. We can't really observe it at the level of the individual plant. And an important feature here when it comes to drought is the diversion of the canopy temperature from the air temperature as an indication of the cooling, of the crop being able to cool or not able to cool. And what you see here on this panel is a relationship of the canopy temperature against the air temperature. And you see that the relationship differs depending on different conditions. And in this case, it's different soil conditions, sandy soil, loamy soil, and whether the crop is irrigated or rain-fed. These are all observed data from a winter rye crop grown in Germany. And very interesting is that the difference between canopy and air temperature can be as much as 8 degrees, the canopy temperature being warmer than air temperature, or cooler up to 6 degrees than air temperature. So that's a huge range, and that's a feature that a crop only can provide, or we can only observe at the crop level, and the processes that determine this are important to understand. And there are diverse management efforts to, or effects to, or measures to interfere with that. So whenever we talk about drought, we also, to some extent, talk about heat. And some reference was actually made yesterday to this interaction between heat and drought. So the patterns of the heat stress is very similar to the pattern of the drought stress. And there is another aspect that is, or perhaps in addition to that, it's not only the heat-drought interaction that we are concerned with, there's an interaction with other stresses that are listed here, and there's an interaction with other climatic variables. When we talk about heat, we talk about temperature, and there's another consideration to make, and that's that temperature affects not only our canopy temperature, it also affects certain physiological processes that are not directly related to transpiration. And here you see a map of the occurrence of the heading time of winter wheat in Germany for two time periods, a period 52 to 1970, and a period 71 to 2030. And the difference in this period is about 14 days due to temperature increase due to a real change in the climate. 14 days difference in the occurrence of heading time has an implication of the stress thermal time that you can measure. And but interestingly enough, the stress thermal time in a fixed period of the year is more or less the same, not in the fixed development stage. The development period is more or less the same, depending on which time period of the year of the years you look at. And one reason for this is that due to the effect of temperature on the development rate, in terms of enhancing the development rate, the crop is moved out of the critical period, which you would expect to occur more in a certain period of the year when temperature warms, and that is sort of depicted by this graph here. So an enhancement of temperature, an increased temperature enhances development rate and moves the plant out of the critical heat stress period. Now those interactions are very important to be considered when we talk about effects of climate change and also effects of drought. But if we move up now from the plant to the crop to the cropping system and farm level, we also have to talk about different crops. And that's also an interesting consideration to make, because we know that crops have different water use efficiencies, and they also show a different behavior to climate variables. And what you see here is a plot of the yield anomalies, 30 years, for crops across Germany, and we see 4 crops here, and they have some considerable variability. But interestingly, the average of these crops shows a smaller variability than the crops in particular, each single crop by itself. And that is also something we, of course, need to consider when we talk about resilience of our farming systems, not about our plants or crops, but of our farming systems, that diversity apparently is also a measure in order to adapt to climate change. This is another panel illustrating that the present climate characteristics can be have different implications for the crops grown. For some parts in Germany, the present weather is already too wet for winter wheat, whereas for sugar beet at the other side of the extreme, it's usually too dry in Germany. So quite a variability, sort of underpinning of what I just said. I make one step further now and take it to the landscape scale. Very little talking about the landscape scale presently, but I think that's an increasing aspect that we should be increasingly concerned with. Because if we talk about water productivity, if we talk productivity, water use, then the landscape also has an important role to play. Because the landscape is not only an arrangement of crops, it's also an arrangement of other land uses, forests, grassland, for instance, and they also all consume water. And the water productivity of a landscape is something that, of course, comes into play if we talk about natural resource use, natural resource management, if you talk about ecosystem services, ecosystem service supply. But it is also the arrangement of the landscape that has an effect on the productivity, water productivity of a specific crop. For instance, if we just look in this indicated section here, it depends on how the area around that field is used in terms of what is the productivity and the water use efficiency of that particular area. Now, these aspects are hardly ever considered so far, and I think they deserve more attention in the future. Now, what sort of means do we have in order to understand the complexity of these systems? On the one hand, we have, of course, experimentation, and this is a simplified list of the types of experiments that we have available in the laboratory: controlled environment experiments, field experiments, farm experiments, landscape experiments, hardly ever done food system experiments. I'm not aware of any. So there's a decreasing role of experimentation for good reasons as you move up the levels of the organization. So on the other hand, or because of that, modeling becomes an important issue. Yesterday there was a reference to the importance of modeling when we talk about drought. Some types of models listed here, and certainly there's an increasing demand for modeling as we move up the scale because we simply don't have the data or the well-performed experiments. And there's an aspect of scaling up the information from the partly well understood relationships at the lower level of the organization to the more integrated performance of our systems at the higher levels of the organization. I'm showing you a few examples now of how models, and these are mainly crop models, have been used to assess impacts of climate change across scales. And this is an example of a use of 30 crop models recently published, assessing the impact of temperature increase, 4-degree temperature increase. Hopefully that will not happen. But this is an example that I've used in order to show you how models are being used in order to perform such assessments. These models have been evaluated or validated with data from field experiments for their ability to reproduce the temperature response of grain yield, and then they have been applied to assess for 30 locations across the globe, representing main wheat growing areas, the impact of climate change, and particularly the impact of temperature increase. And from that study, we could conclude that the 6 a 1 degree increase in temperature results in a 6% decline in global wheat production. There's quite some uncertainty associated to that. Some of that we try to capture by using different crop models. But I will say about a few more words about the uncertainty due to the upscaling effect. Another study, and this is an example of using a gridded approach in order to assess the impact of climate change. I'm missing the scale here, so therefore I will be short. It shows the change of crop yields under climate change with full irrigation, and the colors represent a 10% up to 50% increase in productivity. But consider this is referring to full irrigation, which is not always possible, as we know. If we consider the irrigation that is, or the irrigation water that is available for irrigation, the picture looks different when it comes to the effect on production changes as indicated in this map. We also looked into the net irrigation requirement for different crops in Europe. Again, another example of using an aggregation approach. In this case, we didn't use grid cells, but we used the climate zones. And what you see here is the estimated net irrigation requirement for different crops in Europe. And we had some good confidence in this study that the simulations that we did for the different crops are good, because we had some data available in order to validate the simulations with observed data or water abstractions, and there was a good model performance there. Now, this has then been used to assess the impact of climate change on the changes on the net irrigation requirements, and then you get pictures like this for different crops, 6 crops in Europe, without CO2 considered and with CO2 considered. I'm not going into the details of this presentation, just to show you an example of how models are being used to assess impacts of climate change and including droughts at larger levels of the organization. Because that upscaling is a very difficult task to do, we spent quite a lot of time on understanding the error that comes with the upscaling. And we did a very detailed study in an area in Germany, North Rhine-Westphalia, in which we sort of tried to understand the error that we made due to the aggregation of our input data and due to the sampling. And the two upscaling methods that I refer to are the most prominent ones that are used presently. When it comes to the aggregation error, we see that the error due to the data aggregation, input data aggregation, can be as high as 10% and more, depending on the resolution that you consider and depending on the model that you can end up with. If you take the ensemble mean, the aggregation error is almost 0, but you lose, of course, the variability if you aggregate your input data. And variability and diversity of environments is, of course, something that we are interested in as well. We also learned from these exercises that were able, due to these exercises, to identify the required level of aggregation that we need in order to perform our simulations within an acceptable error. These are 2 error thresholds that we indicate, and you see the resolution, the spatial resolution that is needed in order to be below this error that you are willing to accept in your simulations. We also learned, when it comes to the sampling, or we were able to identify the number of sampling points that is needed in order to be also below an acceptable error. And that's the relationship between the error due to the upscaling and the number of sampling points. And you can see that with less sampling points, your error increases. Once you have generated such relationships, you can indicate an error that you want to accept and find the number of sampling points that are needed in order to be below that error. I'm coming up to my last slide, and this is kind of summarizing some of the considerations that are made. When we talk about linking the problem of the solution to the research on crops under drought, then of course on the one hand we have lots of research on the G, and there's an increasing there's an amazing progress that we observe when it comes to the a better understanding of the G. When it comes to the E, we have to be aware that there's a large range of environments that we need to consider. And I still think we have something to do in order to really understand or consider the range of environments that we are talking about. And there's a presentation on that actually later on in the program. And as long as we don't fully consider this, we certainly need to have a good understanding of how we sample that problem. When it comes to the M for management, we are just at the beginning. We're just at the beginning with respect to how to sample the M and also how to sample the M in the context of the E times M interaction. And when it comes to the scaling up of these results to where the problem occurs at the level of the food security, for instance, then I'm introducing another term here, and that's the S, standing for the scale. And we are just starting to think about that. To understand the G times E times M in the context of the farming, in the context of the landscape and the food system, and to understand and consider other societal demands that we have, and also to account for the missing E and the missing M that we have. And with this, I'd like to thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Frank, for your nice presentation.